Hello and welcome to another edition of Sree's Sunday New York Times Read Along. Our guest is Stephen Roberts, professor, columnist, and best-selling author who covered many of the major events of our time. He's also going to be talking about his latest book, Cokie, A Life Well Lived. My name is Neil Parekh. I am the executive producer of Sree's Sunday New York Times Read Along. We are live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Digimentors website. Here's a quick preview of today's show. This week on Sree's Sunday New York Times Read Along, Stephen V. Roberts, professor, columnist, and best-selling author. Stephen had been married to Cokie Roberts for 55 years. After she died of cancer, he channeled his grief into a book, Cokie, A Life Well Lived. Stephen. Everyone can learn a lot from how she treated others. Cokie did something for someone else virtually every day of her life, and I tried to capture that spirit in the eulogy I gave after her death. Her childhood friend and college roommate, Cinda Pratt Pearlman, came up with the phrase WWCD. What would Cokie do? The book recounts personal and family stories about Cokie. It's essentially a love letter to his wife. We'll also talk to Stephen about his 50-year career in journalism covering the anti-war movement, President Reagan's trip to Moscow in 1988, and 13 presidential campaigns. He still writes a regular column and teaches at George Washington University. Every week, we review the print edition of the Sunday New York Times, taking audience questions and interviewing special guests. The show is produced by Digimentors. We produce high-quality virtual and hybrid events for organizations big and small around the world. We also do social and digital consulting, training, and workshops. Srinivasan is our host. I am the executive producer of the show, Neil Parekh. Our production team includes Paula Kiger, Steve Taylor, Julia Weeks, and Carla Baranakis. Again, Stephen Roberts is our guest. Live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Digimentors website. Thank you very much for joining us. That's just a quick intro, a quick sense of what we're going to cover in today's show. Again, my name is Neil Parekh, and I am the executive producer and occasional guest host of Sree's Sunday New York Times Read Along. Let's go ahead and welcome some of the folks watching this morning. First up, my mom. Good morning, Mom, from watching from Tampa, Florida. Always great to have you join us. Ken Fisher is joining as well. Ken, thank you. Doug Levy is watching from Marin County, California. Please let us know where you're watching from in your comments. We have Jonathan watching from the East Village. Diane Stefani saying good morning. Loving the video preview. Thank you, Diane. And Diane, just want to make sure that we're thinking of you this Sunday. Apollo is joining us from rainy Philadelphia. Here in Springfield, Virginia, it's actually just started snowing when I went out to get the paper this morning, just as a backup. Sree has the paper, but I always get it just in case. Dr. Sujana Chandrasekhar, one of the hosts of She's on Call, is with us. Spring yesterday, snow today. Absolutely. Naomi Service is watching. A happy snow day from the Upper West Side. And thank you very much. And thanks for that comments about the video as well. We have a few more folks that are joining, and we'll welcome them in just a second. But first, I want to bring on our host, Srinivasan. Sree, good to see you.
Good morning. I am so happy to be with you today, Neil. I'm back in New York City. I was in LA for some work, some client work. And I was very tempted to stay on and watch the Super Bowl there because, the Super Bowl is a big part of my year. And I just couldn't afford the cheapest ticket, which was about $3,900. So I decided to get on a plane and come back and host a very small Super Bowl party for 3-4 friends. We're going to be separated out here. Each person is going to have a little chair and a little table with some snacks, and that's how we're going to watch the game. What about you folks? Are you watching the Super Bowl today? Tell us what's going on. Where will you be watching it from? Or are you someone who cares absolutely zero about the Super Bowl? You can tell us that as well. It's also, of course, Valentine's Day weekend and Valentine's Day tomorrow. The book today that we'll be talking about, Cokie, A Life Well Lived, is partly on, we're discussing that today because it's Valentine's Day tomorrow, because this book is a love letter to Cokie, the great Cokie Roberts, by the great Stephen Roberts. And we'll be talking about that. You'll be getting to meet him in just a minute. We'll tell you some of the wonderful headlines and some of the great blurbs that the book has already gotten. I saw Andrea Mitchell loved the book and said it's a beautiful book. The Washington Post is encouraging and enlightening, a celebration of women helping women, and a moving testimony to the remarkable life and legacy of his wife, trailblazing journalist Cokie, who through depictions of her faith, family, work, writing, and friendship, Robert and Steve shares engrossing anecdotes about his partner from their 50 years together. This loving tribute is likely to gain the celebrated journalist a whole new crop of fans. And so everyone, get this book. It might make a great Valentine's Day gift if you're late to the party of getting something for your Valentine. And we will be talking about this, and we'll be hearing a lot of those anecdotes from Steve in just a few minutes. Lots of people watching. I want to just say hello to Macron Boot, who says, snowy Sunday in Park Slope in Brooklyn. I also see that Jamie's watching, tuning in from Dutchess County. And I want to thank Jamie. She promotes the show all week. And it's just so wonderful when our friends are able to share this in the community that we have all built together. Stefan's watching from New Jersey and says, Cokie is always so missed. And thank you, Stefan, for all you do with Digimentors. And we want to say that Carla is watching from New Jersey. Carla is part of the team. Let's do a shout out to our incredible team that puts this together every Sunday. This is like no other show that you get to watch. There's so many webinars, but this is different because of our executive producer, Neil Parekh, at Neil Parekh, Paul Kiger, at Big Green Pen, Steve Taylor, at Steve DeReeve, Julia Weeks, at Julia L. Weeks, and Carla Baranakis, at Kabara. And she does an awesome job booking so many of our guests. I also saw that Jonathan had a comment that said, what is the Super Bowl? So for folks who don't really care about the Super Bowl, there's a whole other thing that I learned about just a couple of years ago, something called Superb Owl. And they celebrate wonderful owls on this day. So Superb Owl or Super Bowl, there's always something you can talk about at this time of the year. We also have the Olympics going on. And of course, the threat of war in Europe with Ukraine and Russia. And we will be able to talk to Stephen about that topic. Not only has he accompanied President Reagan on his only trip to Moscow that Reagan went on, and obviously we'll have a lot to share about that, but he also has family that traces its roots to Ukraine. So he will be paying specific attention to that. Rahajan says, I'll catch a replay later. Everyone, please have a safe day. At least here on Long Island, it's slowing, and the accumulation won't be just a dusting, which sometimes is what the weather folks say here about snow. Roberta's watching from Richmond, Virginia. Roberta, another distinguished journalist in the mode of Cokie Roberts, and so happy to have you here with us, Roberta, and hope we can talk about Ukraine, which we will definitely be doing. We have so much to talk about. Paula is telling us about superb owls on this day, and she's watching from Tallahassee as part of our team. Debbie is watching from DC, and Girl Scout cookie time in February is what she says. So if you haven't ordered your Girl Scout cookies, please do, either from Neil's daughter, Emily, who does Girl Scout cookies, or from anybody in your circles who has a sale of cookies. So things have become so much easier now because of the internet, as in many things. And Sudha says we should also talk about the truckers' threat in the US from Canada. And just as a headline on that, Anybody who thinks this is some kind of organic majority trucker revolution coming from Canada, it is not. 90% of Canadian truckers are vaccinated. By the way, a huge percentage of truckers in Canada are actually of Indian origin. They run Indian origin who run big trucking lines and are also small businessmen and women who have their own trucking lines in Canada, as in the western part of the United States. Lots of Sikh families are in the trucking business. And I think we want to just get a quick look at the paper. And after that, we will bring Stephen on. So a reminder, our guest is Stephen Roberts, who's going to be talking about this book that he wrote about the great Cokie Roberts, A Life Well Lived. And he will be joining us in just a minute after I give you a quick tour of what's happening in the world of the New York Times. I'll also see if I can look out the window so you can see how snowy it is right out there on the Upper West Side. You can barely see New Jersey on the other side over there. That's the Hudson River in between, and you can see some kind of tankers there. But let's look at the paper and the front page lead story. Biden tries to sway Putin, warning of severe costs. Aiming to avert war, U.S. pulls most staff at Kiev embassy. And as someone who grew up in Moscow, who lived there for several years as a kid, and have been to Kiev as a kid, I still am not used to this spelling of Kiev. And also because you see chicken Kiev spelt the more traditional way all over the place. The Ukrainian soldier on the front line. U.S. officials believe Russia may not yet have made a final decision to invade. Ottawa's police react slowly to protest. And selling of Trump blurs lines of politics and profit. Just when you think you've seen every single awful thing that the Trump administration, the Trump family has done, another big important story from the New York Times. As host city Super Bowl is proof of progress. And this is about Inglewood, California. And modern crime, a tech couple and a trail of siphoned crypto. Anyone who's been worried about missing the crypto party, now you know one of the many problems that crypto has. And let's see what else is on in the Times, the front sections. This is the New York Times Magazine. I'm a huge fan of this guy. This is Bob Odenkirk, who plays plays Saul Goodman on Better Call Saul and on Breaking Bad, two of the best shows in television history. If you haven't seen them, please do. And I'm glad to see he's here. He was injured as he was producing the latest season of Better Call Saul. The Business Day cover is Tracking My Husband's Moves. The devices promise to find your keys. They also help create a surveillance state, piece by Kashmir Hill. And when Work for Justice takes Black History Month off, we're not going to fix things in the next 4 weeks. All right. The Sunday Review is Tell Me How to Love You, Lisa Taddeo on the 5 languages of love. Fascinating. We will get a sense of that a little later. Let's look at the Sunday Styles. Is What is Black Love Today? A special collection of modern love essays that illuminate the experience of Black people at this moment. There's a great time to tell you that for Valentine's Day last year, we were able to have Daniel Jones as our guest. He is the creator and editor of the Modern Love column. And if you go back in our collection, which is easy to find on YouTube, you will find the read-along we did with him. It was so interesting, and we all learned so much about a very popular column in the Times. Here is the real estate cover, A Dream That Died in Debt, and keeping an eye on the middle. Will the current median price buy in the borough? What will the current median price buy in the borough in which you live? This is all about New York City. And the first family of Putting It Out There are airing their challenges in a memoir, music, and a frank talk show. Will Jada, Jaden, and Willow Smith have remade the Hollywood household? And that is that family. We're almost done here. The Metropolitan cover. Even if you get the New York Times out in any other part of America or the world, you will not get this section unless you live in the tri-state area. I believe the Metropolitan is only circulated here. As rapid delivery services expand, Berlin offers a cautionary tale. Book review at their own peril. Shackleton, the biography by Ranulph Fiennes. And I wonder if he's related to the other Fienneses. And Lost in the Valley of Death, a story of obsession and danger in the Himalayas by Harley Rustad. So I will look forward to reading that. And the sports sections, I brought out both yesterday's and today's. Coach defends Russian skating star as innocent and clean. And daring, iconic, done. Shaun White ends his run as the legacy will ride on. And finally, because it's Valentine's Day, you'll see that the bottom ad on the New York Times, when Stephen worked at the New York Times, they certainly didn't have ads like this. Color on the front page. New York would love. Cartier, the big fashion brand, has put out a 4 pages of things people say about New York City, the vibrant city that has been Cartier's second home since 1909. I presume the first home is Paris. I lived in New York City for 19 years and I love every single day. Winter in New York City always makes me smile. The window installations of the department stores, the ice skating, bundling up while drinking hot chocolate, and the world famous Christmas tree in Midtown. So there's lots to read here, lots of fun things. But we want to start by bringing onto our stage and our screen Stephen Roberts. Before I do that, just the Muck Rack mug here reminded me that Muck Rack is our sponsor. And we're very grateful to the folks at Muck Rack for sponsoring our show. Please check them out. If you're a journalist, you certainly know them because they have the largest directory of verified journalists in the world. And if you are in the PR business, you know them because they have that directory. If you're a journalist, you can access it for free. And if you're in any other field, you obviously sign up for an account. So big thanks to our friends at Muck Rack. And please let us know if you'd like to be a sponsor of this show by emailing me, Sree@digimentors.group, or Neil@digimentors.group. So let's bring on Stephen Roberts. There he is, professor, columnist, best-selling author who covered many of the major events of our time over the last 50 years. His latest book is Cokie, A Life Well Lived. We are so grateful that Stephen can join us.
Well, I'm delighted to be with you this morning, Sree. And of course, I spent 25 years at the New York Times. I had exactly 1 week between graduating from college and joining the New York Times, 1964. I had what arguably was the best job in journalism at that point for a young person. I became the research assistant for James Scotty Reston, the legendary bureau chief for the New York Times. And in June of 1964, and it was right in the middle of the Goldwater Johnson campaign, and I did research for his columns, and it was an interesting transition because at one point he came to me and said, "I've been reading about Goldwater and the issue of freedom, and I need you to do an analysis of what Goldwater means by freedom by tomorrow morning for my column." And I said, "Boss, that's a half a semester term paper. What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, you went to Harvard. You can do that. You know, you can have it for me tomorrow morning." But he was also a great fan of Cokie's. Cokie and I were already dating. We had met in college when we were 18 and 19. And I came down to Washington. She came back to Washington, too, at that point to move into her family home, Sree, where her many of your listeners know, her father was then a member of Congress. And in fact, I'm sitting in that home right this morning. I mean, I still live in that family home. She and I shared for 42 years together. So Scotty was a big fan of Cokie's, and he would march into my, for those of you who remember Scotty Reston, among other things, he used to smoke a pipe. No one smokes a pipe anymore, but Scotty used to smoke a pipe, and it march in my office, trailing, embers that would be flying all over the place, and say, "When are you going to marry that girl?" And so Cokie always had great fondness for Scotty because I admired him so much that his admonitions to get married, even very young, were very helpful. And we got married in the yard of this very house just 2 years later in 1966. So long history here, my friend.
Well, thank you. And what a legendary home that is, because it belonged to the Boggs family. Let's talk a little bit about them and show some photographs from Cokie's life and your life together. We have couple of pictures here. Here's the Boggs family at the Capitol with Cokie holding her father's hand. The family business was politics, and this building reshaped her entire life, as you can see there.
Well, people wonder how she knew so much about politics when she became a journalist. But look at that. She's 4 or 5 years old, and there's the Capitol behind her. Her 7th birthday party was in the Capitol. When she was a small child, her mom, who was in that picture, who of course later succeeded her father in Congress. Everybody remembers her father spent 30 years in Congress, but her mother spent 18 years in Congress. And she worked for her dad informally but she was always his closest advisor. And so Cokie, as you can see, is the youngest of the 3 kids. And so when Lindy, my mother-in-law, needed a babysitter, she would haul Cokie up to the Capitol and put her on the Senate subway. There used to be a little subway car that ran between the Senate office buildings and the Capitol, and say to the guy who ran it, babysit Cokie for a half an hour. So it was in her bones, but people don't realize, Sree, that the first member of her family, her mom's maiden name was Claiborne, Claiborne. The first Claiborne elected to Congress was in 1797.
Wow.
William Claiborne was elected from Tennessee, eventually became the first governor of the Louisiana Territory. And by some calculation, there's a wonderful story here that a guy named Steve Hess, a historian at Brookings Institution, did a book to try to evaluate the prominence of different families in American political history. And he gave each person who had served in public office a certain numerical weight. And when he originally did the book, the Roosevelts were first, the Kennedys were second, and the Claibornes, Cokie and her mother's family, were third in the rankings in American political history. Cokie, in very typical fashion, read the manuscript and said, "Steve, you have left out about 5 members of my family, and you have to recalibrate your rankings." And now the Claibornes are number 2 in this. And the only reason the Roosevelts are number 1 is because they had 2 presidents.
Yeah.
Claiborne's never had a president, but so this picture just is so emblematic of how she was just soaked in this history, Sree.
Yeah, we have so many great photographs and we have so many great stories. So we will keep moving these pictures along. As you see, Neil's trying to get us to keep going. Working on the yearbook at Stone Ridge, the Catholic school run by Sacred Heart nuns who take girls seriously, a radical notion in the 50s, as Cokie put it. She's in the center, and on her left is her lifelong friend, Cinda Pratt Pearlman. And this is another photo from the book. And there she is. You can see that's her if you
right. Cokie and I are an interfaith couple. She's Catholic. I'm Jewish. We wrote a book about our interfaith marriage. Her friend Cinda went us one better, Sree, because Cinda is the sister of a nun who married the son of a rabbi. But you can't understand Cokie unless you understand how profound the influence of the Sacred Heart nuns, in particular, and the Catholic Church in general, had on her. And because she always said that this school, Stone Ridge, it was a special place because it was a Catholic institution run by women for women. And for a lot of thinking women in the Catholic Church, it's difficult. You're consigned to second-class status. Cokie always used to say, well, the nuns told us we could grow up to be anything we wanted to be, except priests. And that was a source of considerable irritation to her over many years. But she was a devoted mass goer. In fact, someone once asked her, what's your favorite Sunday morning news show? And she said, Mass. So
that's wonderful. And folks, we're talking to Stephen Roberts about his wife and the subject of his new book, Cokie, A Life Well Lived. We want everybody to get this, not just because it's Valentine's Day, but because this is a great look at the career of someone who had such influence in American journalism and someone who had such a great impact. We're going to look at some more photos from the book. Here it is. This portrait of Cokie was taken around the time he and she met in 1962 when she was 18 and I was 19. The initials on her dress stand for her given name, Corinne Claiborne Boggs. So there is CCB.
Actually, that's only a short version of her name.
Okay, let's hear it.
Her full name was Mary Martha Corinne Morrison Claiborne Boggs Roberts. And when she went on NPR for the first time, the bosses said, Cokie, that's kind of a cutesy nickname. I mean, we're a serious news organization. You got to use your real name. And so she had such a devilish sense of humor, Sree. So she goes on the air one night and says, this is Mary Martha Corinne Morrison Claiborne Boggs Roberts reporting for NPR. At which point the head of NPR threw up his hand and said, I give up. you can use Cokie, but it turned out to be an enormous asset to her because she was the only one. And she immediately, the people remembered that name. And she's the perfect 5-letter answer to crossword puzzles. She's been in hundreds of crossword puzzles because crossword puzzle makers like that 5-letter name. And also, it's a favorite dog name. She's had countless dogs named for her. And as far as we know, one dairy cow. Yes, there's only one Cokie in many different ways.
Of course. Tell us the story behind the name itself, Cokie?
Well, it was her younger brother just really couldn't pronounce Corrine, but her grandmother, who was also named Corrine, was named Coco. So it was in the family, and her mother was Corrine and known as Lindy. So it was there were many different origins, but it also had, it was accessible. The name kind of demystified her in a way. And what her appeal was a combination of that enormous authority and experience in understanding politics. I mean, when she was 5 years old, the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, was a regular dinner guest out here in this house. So she grew up with this, but it was at the same time she was authoritative. She was also so accessible, and particularly to other women, particularly when she started going on TV and her career just took off. Over and over again, the producers told me this, that they heard from viewers who said, I'm watching ABC now because Cokie asks the questions I want asked. And Cokie makes the observations I'm feeling because Cokie has lived the life I've lived. Before Cokie, many of the women who were on TV, Barbara Walters and others, came from different backgrounds, and many of them didn't have families. And here was Cokie, long marriage, 2 kids, eventually 6 grandchildren. And people identified with her. So at the same time that she was so authoritative, she was also accessible. She herself called herself a suburban housewife, which was true. It wasn't the whole story, but she did her own shopping at the Safeway. I mean, she never allowed the celebrity to detach her from the views and the experiences and the feelings, particularly of women viewers around the country. And as I did this book, I realized how powerful an element that was in her success, that other women around the country could look at her on TV and say, I can be that strong. I can be that smart. I don't have to hide my views, and I can stand up with those guys and go toe-to-toe with them. And so it became a metaphor in many ways for a lot of women as they watched her. Said, if she can go, she can talk back to Sam Donaldson and George Will, I can talk back to my husband. I can talk back to the men in my family. It was a fascinating dynamic in that sense.
Sure. At our mountaintop home in California, I toss Becca in the air while Cokie, Lee, and Lindy watch. This is a photo that I'm sure brings back great memories. Here is Cokie with the kids on the edge of our patio in California, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. A lovely view, but the isolation caused her to feel pretty lonely at times. And seeing her with that long hair is very special. We should ask you about the moment you met her, since it is Valentine's Day weekend. Was it love at first sight? Was there a lot of courtship involved? What happened?
Both. We met at a student political meeting. I was 19, she was 18. It was the summer of 1962, between our sophomore and junior years in college. And I had met her sister, and she had met my twin brother. And the way she tells the story, she looks across the room and sees someone who looks a lot like Mark Roberts. My twin brother went on to a long career as professor of economics, Harvard School of Public Health. And she said, so she walks over and says, and looks at my name tag and says, it's Steve Roberts. And she says, are you Mark Roberts' brother? And I looked at her name tag and said, are you Barbara Boggs' sister? And that's how we met. And I knew from the beginning that I had met this extraordinary person, but she was the first girlfriend I ever had. And I didn't know what the hell to do. I was petrified. And we went back to Boston. Our dorms were 12 and a half miles apart back in Boston. We went out a few times that fall. And then I stopped calling because I was a total jerk. But as I say, I was 19, and this whole business of falling in love was new to me, particularly falling in love with a Catholic. You got to remember, in those years, neither one of our families, particularly mine, was thrilled with the idea of an interfaith marriage. And but what happened, Sree, maybe 4 or 5 months later, I hadn't called in a long time. We both were coming here to Washington for another student political meeting. And the way things got arranged, we were driving in the same car down from Boston. And I remember approaching the car parked on a back street of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Cokie was sitting in the back seat. And I saw her through the window of the car. And I thought to myself, you idiot, what have you been doing? This is the girl. And we drove down here to Washington, and we stayed in this house where I'm sitting right now. Think of the math, do the math, right? That's the first time I ever came to Washington. First time I was ever in this house. By this time I was 20, a whole 20 years old. And that night, that first night, I had a terrible cough. And so I was ensconced in Cokie's girlhood room. And I hear a knock on the door. And I figure it's 1963, so I figure it's not Cokie, right? And in walks my future mother-in-law, the future member of Congress, the future ambassador to the Vatican, Sree. Okay, that's what my mother-in-law was, the ambassador to the Vatican. She's wearing an off-the-shoulder pink, sort of peach pink negligee, and says, "Why, darling," which was my mother-in-law's universal form of address. "Why, darling, you sound terrible. Drink this." And she hands me a drink, which I'm sure was about 2/3 bourbon. And I was in shock. I mean, I grew up in Bayonne, New Jersey, right across. You showed that scene from your balcony, right across the river. That's where I grew up, right across the river in Hudson County, New Jersey. I had never met. This was an apparition. This was, but the joke in the family is I fell in love with my mother-in-law first and eventually got around to Cokie, and there's a lot of truth to that.
What a story, folks. I'm just grinning this whole time as I'm talking here. There's so much to learn together about this book. And here's that book you wrote about being an interfaith couple, or this was about you and her and your relationship, Cokie and Stephen Roberts, A Half Century of Changing Together by Alex Strauss. This is the article about this. And December 26, 2017, there's the wedding and some other photos. Tell us what's going on. Tell me what you were thinking in these 3 moments.
Well, the wedding photo, you can see how gorgeous she is, right? And her dad at the time was the majority whip of the House. It was 1966. Lyndon Johnson was president. My in-laws were very close to President Johnson. And so actually President and Mrs. Johnson were at the wedding along with an intimate crowd of 1,500 other people. And we got married in the yard of this house. I could point my left hand right out that window is exactly where we were married, in the garden of the house. And because we were an interfaith couple, crafting a service that would keep everybody happy was not easy. We couldn't find a rabbi who would come in those days. But my mother was the one who came up with the answer. She said, you should, in the Jewish tradition, a rabbi is not really a priest in the Catholic sense, but much more of an elder of the tribe. So since you can't find a rabbi, let's find an elder of the tribe. And my mother said, for instance, Arthur Goldberg. Now, it turns out that Arthur Goldberg was a very close friend of my in-laws. He had been on the court, and he had just moved to New York to become the ambassador to the UN. And, of course, was aspiring to run for governor of New York, which, of course, he eventually did, although he was defeated. And so Justice Goldberg was very nice and came to the wedding and gave a talk about Jewish teachings on marriage. He said, I can't pretend to be a rabbi, but I can talk as an elder. And it was just enough so that my parents, my grandparents, I had 2 grandfathers still alive who had been political refugees from Eastern Europe, and political and religious refugees. So it was just enough so that my parents and my family, my parents' friends, felt included. We got married under a chuppah, a Jewish wedding canopy. We broke a glass. We had all many elements of a Jewish wedding, even though Cokie's uncle, who was a Jesuit priest, was the official official celebrant. So from the very beginning, we tried to make the marriage ceremony symbolic of how we tried to merge our two traditions.
Well, you did a great job of that. Dr. Chandrasekhar, who's watching, she's a host of She's on Call, a fabulous show with Dr. Marina Kurian, two surgeons, lifelong friends. And she says, so charming. I'm so happy that that wonderful Cokie had such a long life with this wonderful man. So we're hearing such great stories. I see Carla said this is the most spectacular wedding I've ever heard of. 1,500, by the way, is approaching like an Indian wedding size. So
yeah, without the white horse, though.
White horse or an elephant, you could.
But one of the things that that was so striking about this wedding is, I mean, my in-laws were living on a congressional salary. They couldn't possibly afford a caterer for 1,500 people. So my mother-in-law farmed out the cooking duties to all of her female friends around the neighborhood and around town. And for weeks before the wedding, if you came into the kitchen in this house, you'd see a sign on the oven that said, "I'm a turkey, take me out at 4," and that's sort of how we got through the wedding. But my mother-in-law was this extraordinary figure who, when people wonder, how did Cokie get the idea to write all of those history books about women's influence in Washington? And one of the reasons was she grew up with it in her household. She saw her mother and her mother's friends, Lady Bird Johnson, Pauline Gore, Betty Ford, all of these spectacularly powerful and important women who in that generation derived all of their influence by influencing the husbands. And so she understood Abigail Adams and she understood Dolly Madison because she had seen in her own life her mother and her mother's friends. And by accident of history, of course, Cokie's dad gets killed in a plane crash in 1972. And so Lindy, who had been his advisor and chief confidant for so many years, decides to run for his seat. So by the tragic accident of history, she steps from the backstage into center stage. And so she calls her lifelong friend, in many ways her closest friend, Lady Bird Johnson, to tell her that she's going to run for Congress. And she says, "Bird, I just want you to know I'm going to announce for Hale's seat, and I wanted you to hear it from me before you read about it in the paper." And Mrs. Johnson says, why, darling Lindy, that's wonderful news, but how are you going to do it without a wife?
Wow, folks, I just want to remind everyone we're talking to Stephen Roberts, who's talking about his wife, Cokie Roberts. The book is called A Life Well Lived by Stephen V. Roberts, who has had a fantastic career as a journalist himself and a columnist, spent 25 years at the New York Times. Please share this story. Please share the show right now with a friend. Tag them, retweet, reshare. We're live on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Anyone who loves journalism will love this show and hearing these great stories about Cokie Roberts. So please share right now, tag somebody. I see many of you are doing that already. I'm so glad that we are seeing this. And here is another photo. This is about Greece. When we moved to Greece, Cokie traveled with me on many assignments, including this visit to the ruins of an ancient settlement in Turkey. And Sudha says, your story is thrilling. It seems as if I'm watching a movie, says Sudha, Neil's mom. Yeah. And also she says, thank you for sharing her story. Already shared. Great program, says Naomi Service. Thank you, Naomi, for watching every Sunday as you do. Folks, we do this every Sunday, 8:30 a.m., but it's live and it's recorded. So as soon as we're off the air, on the same links that you have, you can watch the entire show and catch up. Go ahead.
Well, we moved to Greece because I was the New York Times correspondent in Athens, and Cokie came with me. And there's a wonderful story about just before this picture was taken. There was Cokie had produced television shows in L.A. when we lived there. When I was the bureau chief in Los Angeles for the Times, and so as we prepared to go abroad, we figured that perhaps she could hook on with one of the networks to do some part-time stringing. I don't have to tell this audience what a stringer is, but most people don't know what it is. But she made a connection with CBS. And we hadn't been in Athens more than maybe 2 months. And there was a coup in Cyprus. And so I flew out there along with just about every English-speaking reporter in that part of the world. And 2 days later, the Turks invaded Cyprus. And Cokie gets a cable from CBS saying, the Turks have invaded Cyprus, file in 30 minutes. Now think about Cokie Roberts, one of the founding mothers of NPR, recognized as one of the great journalists of her age. And at that moment, when she got that cable, she had never done a radio report in her life. And so she makes her way down to the Reuters office. We had friends staying with us at the time, and they remember Cokie, and Cokie had sprained her ankle, so she was on a cane. And they remember Cokie early that morning, 6:30, appearing in the doorway of their bedroom, waving her cane and saying, the Turks have invaded, I must go file. And so she went down to the Reuters office, got a story out. 2 days later, the Greek government fell. The military government fell as a result of all of the turmoil in that part of the world. And she was virtually the only English-speaking reporter in Athens. And so she tells the story about getting she was in the middle of Athens when word broke that the military government had fallen, and there was cheers and screaming and yelling and celebrations. And she pulls her tape recorder out the window, and she gets all this sound, and she to be able to file in those days, an audio file. It was old-fashioned technology, and they had what they called alligator clips, and you had to take these clips from the tape recorder and unscrew the audio portion of the phone and clip these clips into the internal mechanism in order to transmit the audio file. She commandeers a phone in a flower stall on the edge of the main square of Athens, and the guy in the stall is going crazy, thinking she's a CIA agent or something, taking his phone apart. And she keeps saying, it's okay, I'll buy lots of flowers from you. And she gets this report back to New York. That night, CBS calls her mother and says, do you have a photo of Cokie? And her mother's panicked. I says, why? What's the problem? I said, no. The problem is that this is the most important story in the world tonight, the fall of the Greek government in Athens. And the only report we could get out of Athens today is Cokie's radio report. So we're going to run it as the lead of the Cronkite show tonight, but we want to put her picture up. So the second night or third night she worked for CBS, she led the Cronkite show with this radio report. The short version of it is, Sree, for the next week, she was on the air continuously covering the return of democracy to Athens. I was in Cyprus, and I was under fire and I had no idea this was going on. A week later, the New York Times says, get out of Cyprus, get back to Athens. It's a much bigger story. So I got a military flight to London and then got back to Athens on a commercial flight. I walked through the door of our house. Now let's remember, 8 or 9 days before I had left, she had never done a radio report in her life. I walked through the door and realized I'm now married to a veteran foreign correspondent because she had been filing continuously all that time. And one of the most noteworthy reports in a city like Athens, given the tenuousness of democracy, movement of tanks through the street was a major story. We lived right near the Greek Pentagon, and our 5-year-old was mimicking his mother, and she wasn't paying much attention to him because she was working. He goes out to the main street and he counts all these tanks moving down the street and comes back and says, Mommy, I counted 12 tanks. And Cokie goes on the air for CBS saying, according to reliable sources here in Athens, there's been a major movement of 12 tanks through the center of the city. And people said, Cokie, how could you do that? She said, well, this kid could count. He was 5, I trust him. She usually had better sources than that, though.
What a story. And we have so many photos to get through, Steve. I just want to read a tweet that came through from Lara McCullum, who's a politics and government editor at the Star Tribune, who is watching and says, this is a wonderful interview with Stephen Roberts, husband of the late Cokie. I know she inspired not just female journalists, but journalists all over the country who love seeing her. We saw a great comment about the show with Sam Donaldson that she had with every week, and how much people learn from that. Naomi says this week with Sam and Cokie was always newsy and entertaining. Here's a photo of the two of you. You both started covering Congress, she for NPR, me for the New York Times. And we're often asked to speak together, and you got to write multiple stories together. Let's talk about that. You've had multiple joint bylines. So we're going to take a look at that. And you can talk about what was that like to write with her?
Well, we loved writing together. A lot of couples don't. I remember the story of Jimmy and Rosalind Carter. They almost killed each other by their own testimony when they tried to write a book together. The book editor, Peter Osnos, talks about having to fly to Atlanta basically to broker a peace treaty between the two Carters. But we always enjoyed writing together. This article was one. We came back to Washington in '77. So the first big national political campaign that we covered was in 1980, the Reagan election. And we had, our children were 10 and 12 that year. And, I've talked to a lot of young people over the years, as you have. Both of us teach college and teach journalism in college. And one of the things that I have said to my students is, it's, the critical thing for young families is not how many hours you work. It's who decides which hours you work. And so by covering voters, we were introduced an element of control in our lives. If we had been covering candidates, things would have fallen apart with two kids back home. This way, we were able to plan our trip somewhat. And so at the end of this primary season, June of 1980, we had been both covering voters, sometimes together, often separately. And I got this idea that we'd write this piece for the Sunday magazine together. Just as this was being edited, we had so much material. They had to cut a couple thousand words out of the piece right at the last minute. Cokie was out on the campaign and wasn't home, so I had to do the cutting. And she was furious with me. Absolutely furious with me. She said, "Stephen, you're cutting out all the quotes from my voters and keeping in the ones from the ones you interviewed." But we loved writing together. We wound up writing 2 books together. One of the books was a Passover Haggadah. Many of our listeners will know that the Haggadah is the book that at Passover you read the prayers and the rituals and the stories. And long backstory, but Cokie, as the Catholic, had written a Haggadah years before, which we used in our own family seders for many, many years. The joke in the family was that Cokie was the best Jew in the family. She would always reply that there was not a lot of competition for the title, but it was true. She definitely was. Because she was a believer, and she embraced my Jewish heritage with great joy. And so she had written this Haggadah, which we had used. It was on mimeograph paper, and people in the Jewish book world heard that we had this Haggadah and said, "Well, why don't we publish it as a book, particularly aimed for interfaith families?" So we started editing the original Haggadah, and I thought, it could use some freshening. So I started editing it, and she got furious with me. She said, "This is sacred text, Stephen. You cannot change a word." I said, now, I did not stay happily married to this woman for 53 years by ignoring those moments when she felt so strongly about something. So, "Yes, dear, whatever you say, dear." Then she starts editing it, right? And I said, "Wait, Cokie, you told me that I couldn't change a word. This was sacred text." And she says, "That's right, Stephen. I told you you couldn't change a word, but because I wrote it, I can change it." Now, we came to a détente, and we both contributed to this book. But this was the second book actually about interfaith marriage that we had written, because we'd written an earlier book called From This Day Forward. Because in my years teaching young people, one of the inspirations, Sree, and perhaps you run into this as well, when you mentor young people, what you teach them about journalism in the classroom is only a part, in some ways a small part, of what you're teaching them. And so many of my students wanted advice about how do you have a career and marriage and children, and particularly in our day, it was interfaith marriages. Now it's interracial marriages. It's same-sex partnerships. It's non-binary relationships. But at the core, it's all the same question, which is how do you have a loving partnership and a successful career? How do you combine the two? And so that's why we decided that perhaps there was something we could contribute by telling stories about our marriage to give people encouragement that this was possible. There's a great story about this cover. We went to New York in Manhattan to get this cover photo. Each one of us was told to bring about 6 changes of clothes, different colors, different textures. This is the only time in my life I ever had this experience in this very high-end fashion studio on the west side of Manhattan. And the dirty secret was, on the day this photo was taken, we had not written one word of the book, not one word. But we made the deadline, and we found out, Sree, as we originally thought we would tell this book in a common voice. But anybody who's been married more than about a week and a half knows that you can't do that, because we kept disagreeing on everything. So about what really happened. So this book is told in dialogue form, and I would tell a story, and she would say, "That's not how it happened." And we kept that all in the book, because and in fact we did the audio version of the book together, which was really fun, because we sort of duplicated our our conversations.
I want to say, Steve, that your hair looks better today than it did then. With so much to cover, Cokie took total delight in our 6 grandchildren. Here she shares a laugh with our oldest, Regan, I guess.
Regan, yes.
Regan, yeah, who was clever enough to get herself born on my 58th birthday. Beautiful, and just great to see that. All 6 grandchildren and their parents around Cokie and me at her mother's 90th birthday in 2006. What a lovely photograph there. And Cokie always loved spending time with our grandchildren at our beach house in South Carolina. She would rise early with our youngest, Cecilia, pictured here, and watch the big red ball rise out over the ocean. I hope you never corrected her about what you call that. We celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary in 2016 on the same spot in the garden of our home where we had been married. And if you're joining us late, we saw pictures of the wedding of Stephen and of Cokie, where 1,500 people were gathered. So if you're joining us late, rewind after the show is over and watch that from the beginning. We have a lot to get through with the paper, so we're going to switch to that. But before that, Mark Lee had asked for a favorite Cokie story, but I want everybody to buy the book instead of hearing another story from Stephen at this moment. But I want to share my story about Cokie, someone I'd admired since I was a little kid watching her on television. And she did stand out as a female reporter on the air. And I was obsessed with American journalism as a kid. I arrived here at the age of 9. But in 2018, I sat across the aisle from her on a plane from DC to New York. It's a short flight, as you know. I didn't want to disturb her. She was sitting right there. And on the way out, I helped her get her back down, and I asked her what she's doing. And she said she's going to Africa to work with Save the Children, one of her great loves. And I thought that there'd be a party waiting for her outside the plane. And instead, she was walking by herself to the air train and all of that. And so I said, "May I come with you and help you?" And she said, "Sure." So we chatted. We were only together for 30 minutes, but that entire meeting is burned into my brain. And as you can see here, that's the two of us. I'm wearing my SAJA, South Asian Journalists Association cap. She asked about it, and we talked about that. And she was going by herself at her not so young age, all the way to Africa to help in a village. And it took us, it's about a 15 or 10-minute walk, but it took us 30 minutes, Steve, because as you know, people kept stopping her and saying, thank you for what you're doing, especially during those Trump administration days. She was speaking truth to power. And there was this photo, you don't quite see it, but an African-American woman who was genuinely grateful to her for everything that she was doing, speaking truth to power.
Well, your story is a lovely one, and I've heard countless stories like it. But as I wrote this book, it was certainly true that the public Cokie was tremendously important, and your story certainly illustrates it very well. She was so encouraging and supportive, particularly to women, which is a theme that ran through her entire life, whether it was going to Africa to help when she went to Africa for the Save the Children, her great mission was to keep girls in school. That was her great belief, that if you kept girls in school, it had so many benefits to a society and to families. But, Sree, as eminent as she was, not everybody can be Cokie Roberts, the TV star or the radio star or the best-selling author. But I came to realize that everybody can be a good person. And in some ways, the most important message for me from this book is not the public Cokie, it's the private Cokie. She did something good for somebody else every single day. She lived the gospel. She lived the gospel every day. I'll just tell you one story, because I'm sure that out of hundreds in the book, but many listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with Nina Totenberg. Of course, then and, for many, many years, the Supreme Court correspondent, still is for NPR, and one of Cokie's best friends. And when Nina's husband died, as Nina told the story, Cokie ran his death. Cokie took over, planned the funeral, got him buried at Arlington. He was a World War II decorated veteran. Nina, by her own telling, was just at sea, and Cokie just takes over. And finally, they have to go to the funeral home to pick out a casket. Now, what kind of friend goes with you to pick out a casket for your husband, right? I mean, you got to be a pretty good friend to do that. Nina tells me the story. They're at the funeral home, and the somewhat obsequious clerk at this home is trying to sell her a more expensive casket for her husband. And he says to her, well, Nina, Mrs. Totenberg, your husband was a very tall man, so he'd be much more comfortable in this more expensive casket. At which point, Cokie and Nina turn to each other and break out laughing. Now, what kind of friend not only goes with you to pick out a casket for your husband, but then can laugh with you over the casket? It takes a pretty special friend. And she was at every maternity ward in the zip code, and she loved babies. And this one of her young friends told me the story that Cokie was the first one in her hospital room after she had a child, and Cokie barges in, picks up this newborn tyke, and starts baptizing it. And this young friend says, Cokie, you know that's a Jewish baby, don't you? And Cokie said, oh, of course, Lana, I know you're Jewish. I know it's a Jewish baby, but I'm sure you wouldn't mind. We're just covering our bases here. And she continues to baptize the baby. But those private stories, Sree, of generosity, of friendship, and particularly to women, this sense of solidarity, because Cokie always said something so important. She said, look, as we as women become so much more prominent, so much more equal, so much as we advance in our careers, and no one was a more ferocious feminist than Cokie in terms of promoting and supporting and encouraging and advancing other women, no one. She always said women cannot forget their traditional roles either. We can't forget that we're the caretakers, we're the nurturers, we're the keepers of the family flame. No matter how advanced we get in our professional and lives, we have to maintain that essential role in families. And she never forgot that.
Thank you so much. We have only about 30 minutes left, and we've got so much to talk about. Nick says, what a great story, Sree, about your meeting Cokie. And Lippy Roy, who's been a guest on the show, Dr. Lippy Roy, who's done such great work during the pandemic, explaining facts and lies and exposing those lies. She says, greetings from Manhattan. I knew her from This Week with Sam Donaldson and Cokie Roberts, which I used to watch every Sunday with her father. That's lovely. And by the way, Dr. Roy was just on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, which for a lot of people, that's the ultimate great thing that somebody can do. And Naomi says, a perfect love story for Valentine's Day. So we're going to switch to get to the paper, and we want to hear Stephen analyze and talk about the New York Times and what's in the paper today. So much going on. As a foreign correspondent and as someone with connections to Ukraine, I'm especially interested in your thoughts on the front page lead story. Biden tries to sway Putin. So if you can talk about this and what you know of the story and what you're thinking about the coverage.
Well, of course, I'm not covering it, and so therefore, what I know is second or third hand. But as you mentioned, all four of my grandparents were political refugees from Eastern Europe, the area not exactly in the Ukraine, but just right next door in Belarus, which of course is in the news a lot because Soviet troops are massing in the northern border of Ukraine in Belarus, and that's where my grandparents are all from. Their villages were about 50 kilometers apart, but they're actually in 3 different countries today: Belarus, Poland, and Lithuania. But so there's nothing new about this. There is, my grandparents grew up describing themselves as Russian because that whole territory was under the Tsar's influence when they were growing up there, and so you have to put this in historic perspective. The elemental, primal yearning of Russia to expand westward today, showing itself in Ukraine, has always been there. It has always been there. You can only understand Putin and understand his ambitions by understanding that this is central to the whole Russian political DNA. And in the years when my grandparents were growing up there, late 19th, early 20th century, it was all Russian. In fact, my 2 grandfathers came to America primarily to escape service in the Tsar's army, which was a reason many Jewish immigrants came to America in those years. And that's one of my thoughts as I listen to this and think about back to my grandparents, that this is an ancient impulse. There's nothing new about it. Second thing that my thought is that I've actually been reading as a hobby. I read a lot of World War II history, and I've been reading several books about 1940, 1941, The Splendid and the Vile, by Eric Larson, Citizens of London by Lynn Olson, 2 books that I've read recently. And what you see in those books in 1941 was the profound failure of the Roosevelt administration to confront Hitler. Yeah. And history now thinks of FDR as this great leader and this great courageous leader. But the fact is, 1940, 1941, he was very timid. And he felt that America was not ready to enter the war, that public opinion was very much against American involvement. And he kept putting it off and putting it off and putting it off, and endangering profoundly the survival of Great Britain. And in fact, there's a wonderful scene in Lynn Olson's book, Citizens of London, when and it sounds very strange, but it's certainly true, that when Pearl Harbor happened, the American ambassador to Britain, Wynant, and Churchill did a dance of glee despite the tragedy of Pearl Harbor. Why? Because then they knew that America would enter the war. And absent that cataclysm, Roosevelt's timidity would have kept America out of the war. So when I think about this, my view is you can't feed the beast. You have to stand up to this kind of tyranny. You have to stand up to this kind of endless, bottomless, voracious appetite for territory and domination in Europe. We have seen this movie before.
And we should also say that Putin, being a former KGB officer, is someone you just cannot trust in any way. I grew up for part of my life in Russia and the Soviet Union in Moscow. I was very young when we left, but I know the way in which the surveillance state, the duplicities, the lies are a big part of how they operate. So whatever he's telling Biden only goes so far in being accurate. And by the way, we've been talking about interfaith relationships and Jewish history and all of that. And I just remember when you mentioned the Tsar's army, there's a great line in Fiddler on the Roof where the rabbi is asked, "Is there a blessing for the Tsar?" And he says, "Yes, there is. May God bless and keep the
Tsar far away from us." Yes, absolutely. And but so it's, we're all shaped by our histories and our experiences, but you cannot read about the history of Europe and particularly Britain in 40 and 41 without saying there's only one answer here, and that's to be as stern as possible. Now, I understand the geopolitics, I understand the economics, I understand Europe. It could be far more damaged by economic sanctions than we would be, but I think it's absolutely essential that Biden rally a united Western front against this, because history is pretty clear about this. You know, you think that if Putin gets away with going into Ukraine, is that going to be the last piece of Eastern Europe he's going to swallow up? History is so clear about this. The beast is never satisfied. The beast never stops eating until you stop it.
So a question for you, what should Obama have done differently when Crimea was eaten by the beast?
You know, I'm not good at hypothetical questions. I guess looking back, this was a profound mistake, you know, in not standing up to him then. Of course, it's easy to say that, and then it's much harder to say, okay, therefore, what would you do? You know, I just mentioned how historically there were two lessons here. Yes, you got to stand up to tyranny, but it's also true that that comes at a great cost. You know, one of the reasons why there was so much reluctance in America in 40 and 41 was not only, you know, World War II had only been fought a generation before, but there was this notion it's not our fight. And, you know, NATO comes close to the borders of Ukraine, but Ukraine is not a NATO country. And it's a profoundly difficult and frustrating question about, can economic sanctions deter Putin's military ambitions? Clearly, there is not any kind of appetite in the West, either here or in Western Europe, among NATO allies, to confront him militarily in the Ukraine. Now, if he moved beyond the Ukraine, if he moves into a country like Estonia, which is a NATO member, or Romania, then you have the NATO treaty, which would immediately and instantly trigger a military response. But when you're talking about these borderlands, Ukraine, Georgia, these areas that were once under Soviet sway, it's easy for me to sit here and say, stand up to Putin. Then you say, okay, then how do you do it without military action? It's not an easy question. But in some ways, because Putin has integrated the Russian economy with the West, this gives us more leverage.
That's what we hope. Ron Thomas is checking in from Dubai. Hi, Ron. Better late than ever. Greetings, everyone. He sat at my dining table here, Stephen, one of the last guests in person before we had to move to virtual. And Ron, I'll be seeing you in Dubai in April. It's Super Bowl Sunday, and I know you have season tickets to now what are called the Commanders. Tell us who you have for tonight's game. And by the way, I've been always wondering, people in India who don't follow American football, obviously, they're seeing a team called the Bengals, pronounced Bengals in India, and the Rams, what they would be thinking. But who do you have for tonight's game?
That's funny. Well, you know, I'm rooting for the Bengals just because they're so much the underdog. You know, Cincinnati is also a great city that I visited many times as a political reporter. In the years when I was covering politics, Ohio was the most important political state in the country in many ways. It was the quintessential swing state, and I spent a lot of time in Ohio as a reporter, and I also, because I grew up in Bayonne, New Jersey, right across the river from Manhattan. And it was an enormously valuable experience as a young political reporter, because it was a very ethnic town, very full of immigrants. My grandparents were typical, many Polish families, Italian families, Irish families. And so a city like Cincinnati, soaked in its immigrant history, I just am very fond of it. I used to say that as a political reporter surrounded by somewhat more privileged and well-born colleagues at the New York Times, they had no idea what a kielbasa was, let alone knew how to spell it. But I knew every way there was to spell kielbasa, which of course is a Polish sausage.
Nice.
So I'm rooting for the Bengals. You can root for the Bengals because of Bengali. I'm going to root for them because of kielbasa.
I love it. And this is a headline in history. For folks who missed it, we talked about how Stephen's mother-in-law had her best friend named Lady Bird Johnson. And here's her husband in the headline. Johnson honors ideal of Lincoln. In 1966, on Abraham Lincoln's birthday the day before, President Lyndon B. Johnson laid a wreath at the slain president's memorial and said the nation had made unprecedented progress in fulfilling the ideals for which Abraham Lincoln stood. He said that in 6 months since he had signed the Voting Rights Act, over 300,000 Black people had been added to voter rolls in 5 southern states. And as we come to Lincoln's birthday, we should note that all of that's in danger now, Stephen, and just absolutely horrible. I also see in the New York Times, they say that a survey shows that 71% of Republicans believe that Biden was not legitimately elected. And that's where we are as a country.
Well, you know, that quote you read from President Johnson, that was 6 months before he attended our wedding, 6 months before. But 6 months before that, my father-in-law, Hale Boggs, had voted for that Voting Rights Act. And it was a great act of courage politically, because he represented the city of New Orleans. And as many of our listeners know, President Johnson quite accurately and presciently said, as he signed the Voting Rights Act, that this is going to turn the South Republican. And it did. When I talk to my children and grandchildren about their father, grandfather, great-grandfather, the speech that my father-in-law gave on the floor of the House in support of the Voting Rights Act, not only did he vote for it in the summer of 1965, but he spoke for it on the floor of the House. Wow. And he was you remember the New York Times used to have this feature, man of the day, it wasn't a person of the day, it was the man of the day, I guess they called it. And the day after that, Man in the News, it was called Man in the News. And the day after his speech, he was featured on the front page of the New York Times as the man in the news for that courageous speech he gave in favor of that voting rights bill. 3 years later, in 1968, he almost lost his seat. It was the closest election in America that year because of Johnson signing that bill. Johnson was absolutely correct. It re-energized the Republican Party in the South.
In Fiji, Blinken says U.S. has long-term future in the Pacific Islands. I went to high school, Steve, in Fiji. And by the way, whenever I see Blinken's name, I always think of A. Blinken because his Twitter handle is also A. Blinken. So when he says it together, it sounds like Abraham Lincoln.
You don't think of Winkin, Blinken, and Nod?
Oh, yes, I do too for that. Biden administration aims to avert war by wielding information. There was a very interesting exchange, which you may have seen, between the AP writer and the spokesperson for the State Department, saying, how do you know, or how should we trust you? Why should we trust you? There was a time when you could trust almost everything the government would tell you, but no longer, as we know. COVID is surging in vaccine hesitant Russia, and that's another thing that he's trying to obviously detract from by waving his sword. Black authors break into Brazil's literary scene. By the way, we're done with about 12 pages of the paper, Stephen, and we have another 100 to go. So I hope you're settling in for the long haul. We'll actually only have 15 minutes, so we're going to try to cover as much as we can, give everyone a sense of what's in the paper. I'd like to hear from you what it meant to work for the New York Times, to represent it, and how you look at it today in terms of its scope and breadth.
Well, that's a very good question. As I mentioned earlier, I had exactly 1 week between the New York Times and college. In fact, my relationship with the Times started long before that. In those days, when I was in college in the early 60s, the Times had stringers on many campuses, particularly Ivy League campuses. And I got that job at the end of my freshman year. Wow. So I started working for the Times as a stringer on college campus when I was 18 years old. And in fact, the first story I ever wrote for the New York Times, first assignment, spring of 1961. I was a freshman in college, and I was assigned to cover a crew race on the Charles River. And I'd never covered a crew race before. So I had this brilliant idea that I would ride in the boat behind the rowers, and the judges would explain to me what was going on and why one team won and one team lost. And it was a brilliant idea until the race was over and the boat didn't dock. They broke out the booze and they started a cocktail party. And I had to get to the shore to file my first story for the New York Times. I thought about jumping overboard. We finally docked, and there was a messenger from Western Union jumping up and down on the dock saying, "Who's Roberts? Who's Roberts? The New York Times is screaming for your story." And I missed the deadline with the first story I ever wrote for the New York Times because I was stuck in the middle of the Charles River.
What a story. And the book is full of such stories, folks. You should all get Cokie, A Life Well Lived by Stephen V. Roberts. And look at this. The force is still with John Williams, who is now 90 and plans to keep composing. We all know that name, and we know his music even better. And this is the, while you're talking about the Times, I'm just looking through the different
Well,
sections.
I spent 25 years. I went to the city staff after my year with Scotty Reston, and became the bureau chief in Los Angeles, Athens, back to Washington, congressional correspondent, White House correspondent. I loved my 25 years at the Times, and it's still the first thing I read every day. You as a teacher would particularly appreciate this. Just this week, one of my best former students accepted an offer to become a contributing columnist to the New York Times.
Wow.
Her name is Megan Stack. She's a former foreign correspondent for the Los Angeles Times. But so it's sort of full circle. It's like teaching the child of one of your students, right? Yeah. When one of your students works for your old newspaper, it's a wonderful sense of accomplishment.
Walter Greason, who's been on our show multiple times, says great focus on what is Black love in today's New York Times. The history is fraught with the examples of leaders denying the humanity of Black people. Even today, medical doctors still apply disparate standards for Black people's emotional and physical capabilities. And that's one of the things that I think there's much more awareness of, Steve, from the days when you started in the business, but there's still a long way to go. And it's important that we note that. And that's the cover of Sunday Style. So everyone, please check that out. You're mentioning former students. So I want to give a shout out to Rena Ninen, fabulous journalist who you've had a chance to mentor and teach. And she said to me, when I told her that we were interviewing you, she said, "I owe my entire career to Stephen Roberts."
Well, she's exaggerating, but I do love her, and she's been one of my great students. But, you mentioned something very important. When I went to work for the New York Times, 1964, almost everybody looked like me. Straight, white, male, Ivy League educated. And I think there are many ways in which the Times has changed, many for the better, not all for the better, but one that is certainly very, very important is how much more diverse the Times is today than it was. The view of the world centered in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, frankly, among white men, just was such a tiny slice of the world. And I love reading the Times today. And the Sunday paper you've just read reflects so many more, such a wider diversity of perspectives and viewpoints and subjects than the Times of my era. And that's, I think, the single best change I've seen in the Times since I worked there.
Thank you. And here is the Supreme Court is just doing its thing. There's a very important piece by Jamel Bowie. And by the way, Ross Douthat, who I used to like to read, he was the young whippersnapper at the Times, but he's so wrong on a regular basis in the New York Times on various issues. Sunday business cover, tracking my husband's moves. The devices promise to find your keys, but they also help create a surveillance state. And when Work for Justice takes Black History Month off, we're not just going to fix things in the next 4 weeks. And lots of interesting things here to read, as always. Do you have time to watch lots of television? Do you have any shows you particularly like? I know in the family, you're probably partial to West Wing because Cokie was name-checked on it.
She was name-checked on many shows. She was portrayed on Saturday Night Live. She was a favorite on late night television because she was so quick and funny. When live TV was she was a great reporter, but live TV was her real arena where she shined. I don't watch a lot of TV. I watch a lot of sports. I'm a huge sports fan, but I tend to watch sports where I care who wins. So I'm a lifelong New York Yankees fan, having grown up in New Jersey, and I watch a great many New York Yankees baseball games. I'm a huge fan of Duke basketball because my son went to Duke, and I watch all their games. And then the team formerly known as the Redskins, now the Commanders. So a lot of my TV watching is sports, and then I'll watch some shows streaming. In fact, last night I watched a couple of episodes of Grantchester, which is this wonderful series on PBS about a vicar in rural Britain. But Cokie was very devoted to the news on TV and the Sunday shows, but I haven't quite continued that loyalty.
This, by the way, if you are looking ever for a show to watch, Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad, which one is a prequel to the other, are two of the greatest shows in the history of American television. And Bob Odenkirk is the star of both, is a star of both of them. And here's Christopher Walken. There's so much to read in the paper, and we won't have a chance to get through all of this. But look at this: Cheetos Crunchy Flaming Hots as a letter of recommendation in the New York Times. This is one of the ways in which the Times has changed. It's much more playful and much more into like pedestrian pop culture, not just the highbrow stuff. And I think,
I used to say that you could work for the New York Times or you could read it, but you couldn't do both.
I love that. We just want to quickly look at the book review and see what's on the cover at their own peril. Two biographies, of one of Shackleton, and the other is Lost in the Valley of Death, a story of obsession and danger in the Himalayas. So those would be interesting books as well. And I hope to see your book reviewed in here in the weeks ahead. So what we're going to do, Stephen, is, because we're almost out of time, is we're going to take a quick break and do some housekeeping for just two minutes. We're going to come back and ask you to be a little more marketing-y about your book and tell us why everybody should buy this book. And also, if you can give us a pro tip, something for readers, writers, journalists, about being a writer that they should all know, and we will record that and keep that. So we're going to come back to you in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to ask Neil to come back and talk to us. And I know he's a big Yankees fan, so he'll want to exchange a word or two about that with you.
Absolutely. I couldn't help but put up the comment and the ticker, Steve. So we'll chat in just a minute. Sree, that was such a great conversation with Stephen Roberts,
Amazing.
author of Cokie, A Life Well Lived. To get some of those stories, the background, and what a family. I didn't know that about Cokie's family in terms of being having that history in America. I knew about her father, obviously, and her mother, but not her forebear. And there, of course, you're showing the book, Cokie, A Life Well Lived, which is great.
By the way, Liz Pressman says, thank you for this wonderful show. Please have your guest return. And Mark has been asking. By the way, Mark asked some great questions, so everybody should look at his questions. And he's a Durham person, so he says he lives around the corner from Duke, and I'll be seeing you, Mark, when I come to visit my family out there in Dukeland. But Diana asked a question: if Stephen hadn't been a writer, is there another profession he would have selected? So we can ask him that afterward. But we want to do a couple of quick housekeeping things. Go ahead, Neil.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sree. First, of course, we want to thank our team: Paula Kiger, Steve Taylor, Julia Weeks, and Carla Baranakis. They do a great job of putting the show together every week, from booking to putting in comments during the show, research, etc. This is a production of Digimentors, the social and digital consulting firm that Sree co-founded. We produce high-quality virtual and hybrid events. We also do social and digital consulting. So if you are interested in having us produce a show like this for you, please reach out to us. You can reach Sree at Sree@digimentors.group, or me at Neil@digimentors.group. And we'd love to talk to you about your next event. I want to give you a heads up on next week's guest. I'll be stepping in to guest host, and our guest will be Professor Stefan Bradley. Stefan is a professor of Black Studies and History at Amherst College, the author of 2 books in particular, Upending the Ivory Tower, Civil Rights, Black Power, and the Ivy League, and Harlem versus Columbia University, Black Student Power in the late 1960s. I had the pleasure of hearing him speak several times at conferences for United Way, and you won't want to miss it. He's going to be a great guest. We also want to make sure that you know about the Local Connection newsletter. Carla Baranakis puts it out for the Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University. Each week, it offers story ideas and pro tips for journalists. And best of all, it's free. Subscribe at bit.ly/local news tips. bit.ly/local news tips. Sorry. Finally, I want to give a heads up for Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Our friend, our Digimentors colleague, Stefan Kaplan, Spin It Social on all social media channels, is hosting his revamped talk show, Let's Talk Social Media for Social Good. And he is having a guest that is no stranger to Sree, S. Mitra Kalita, who is most recently at CNN. And she is the co-founder both of Epicenter New York and also URL Media, a great newsletter. And Sree, I want to make sure, fact check this before I say it on air. Her relationship to your family, how close is she to your family?
She's the godmother of my twins and also former student, as we just heard from Stephen, watching our students go from the bottom of the job ladder to the heights that they go to is one of the great joys of being a professor. And I'm glad that Stefan will be interviewing Mitra next week. So please do check this out on Wednesday, February 16th. And we're just glad that you can all join us and we can see Mitra in action. There's a lot going on, folks. We have so many great comments coming in, but I think we're ready to bring Stephen back.
Absolutely.
And everyone, as soon as we're off the air, this will be live. This will be recorded and available instantly on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Tag a friend, somebody who would benefit from watching this episode and learning from Stephen and remembering Cokie Roberts. Okay, let's bring Stephen on. Hey, Stephen.
Stephen, thank you so much. It was just such a great conversation, and we all watched Cokie and heard her on the radio. It truly was. The book truly is a Valentine for her. So thank you for sharing this with us.
And Liz says, I worked with Cokie Roberts and Deborah Roberts, not related, I believe, for a brief time on a Lifetime town hall on racism. Cokie was a consummate professional and so compassionate and open at the same time. She was one of a kind. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, yes. And I just want to reemphasize what I think is the main message of this book, because not everybody can be Cokie Roberts, the star, but everybody can be Cokie Roberts, the friend, the mother, the godmother, and to my mind, the stories that really echo. I tried very hard to talk to her female friends, to have them tell these stories in their own words. I did not want to be the guy who tried to interpret women's feelings, and what echoes through this book is this devotion every single day. One day, a friend of hers lost a brother, came back to work, and Cokie appeared in the doorway of her office and closed the door and said, "Jane, talk to me." And Jane just wept for an hour and turned to Cokie and said, "You're the busiest person I know. How can you spend an hour here in the middle of the workday consoling me?" And Cokie said, "Jane, at this moment, the most important thing I can do is to be here and be your friend." And that's how she lived her life. People say, how did she do this all? She had all these careers, 5 best-selling books, radio star, TV star, went around the world for Save the Children. How did she do it? Because she understood priorities. Everybody gets 24 hours. And she said at that moment, the most important thing she could be was a friend, not a star, not a best-selling author, but a friend. And that, to me, is the most important legacy she left behind.
Wow. Thank you so much. And it's a lesson for all of us who don't use the 24 hours as we could and we should. And also a tribute to great partnerships And I know Neil and I are lucky to be in great partnerships ourselves, but so are so many other people. But we do want to ask you one pro tip, if you could share something that everybody should, if they're getting in the business or already in the business, something about writing. Go ahead, please.
Well, I also teach writing. It's not just that I'm still a journalist, but I actually teach writing at George Washington University. Thought a lot about this. And I tell my students, look, if there was a secret, if there was a shortcut to becoming a good writer, I'd tell you. I wouldn't keep it secret, but there isn't. There's only one clear, obvious answer to your question, and that's to write. That's to write as often as possible, hopefully find a mentor. I tell my students rejection slips are badges of honor. They're badges of honor. There's not a writer in the history of the world that hasn't gone through rejection. The first half dozen articles I wrote for the Times Sunday magazine got rejected, and then they finally took the next 20. So keep at it. Keep at it. Keep doing it. Hopefully find a mentor who can help you, guide you through it. But there's absolutely only one way to become a good writer, and that's to sit down there and face the terror of that empty screen and keep doing it.
Lovely, lovely, lovely. Thank you so much. Mark says, amazing show and amazing guest. Naomi Service says, one of the best shows, great teamwork and guest. And Diana asks, great show. Cokie was clearly one of a kind. Many lessons to learn from her. And by the way, she's watching California time, so she's been up since 5:30. And Sudha says, great show. We need Stephen back a second time on this platform. Thank you. So we gave Sudha the first word, and I will give her the last word here. Neil's mom, watching from Tampa, where I presume they're mourning the end of the Brady career, though he may come back maybe to play for the 49ers one last time, his hometown team. I'm hoping that he will do that. Even though I hate his guts, he was a great, great player, the greatest quarterback in football history. Have a great Sunday, everybody. I know it got off to a great start because of Stephen and this wonderful show. We all learned so much. I did, and I'm energized for everything that's to come. And to everybody, please go out and get this book. Give it as a gift, and perfect for Valentine's Day. Cokie, A Life Well Lived. And by the way, we read all those blurbs, but we didn't read the ones from the back of the book jacket. I won't read them, but just tell you who's on the back of the book jacket. Barack Obama, Nina Totenberg, John Lewis, Nancy Pelosi, George Bush, Jake Tapper, and Mariah Shriver. What a great list of people saying wonderful things about Cokie. So Cokie, A Life Well Lived, should be on everybody's bookshelf.
Thank you so much. Good to be with you.